He had lived alone long enough to forget what trouble looked like, until the night two Apache girls collapsed against his fence. Ethan Callahan first noticed the blood before he noticed the figures. Just a thin smear across the weathered cedar posts of his ranch fence, dark against the pale dust of the high desert. Out here, 10 miles from the nearest road, and almost 30 from the nearest town, a stain like that meant only one thing. Someone had come too far from where they belonged. Ethan stood still on his porch, the late evening wind dragging slow lines through the grasslands beyond his barn. The sun had already slipped behind the distant red hills, leaving the land washed in the dull gold light that comes just before night claims everything. For 8 years this ranch had been quiet. No visitors, no neighbors, just cattle, wind, and the sound of his boots on dry earth. He preferred it that way. A lonely rancher learned quickly that peace was a fragile thing, and strangers had a habit of breaking it. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching softly in the gravel, and walked toward the fence line where the smear of blood caught the fading light. That was when he saw them. 2 figures huddled low against the wooden rails, half hidden in the tall grass. Women. Or girls, maybe. Hard to tell in the dim light. One of them shifted slightly, enough for the last sliver of sunset to reveal dark braids across her shoulders and the beaded trim of a worn Apache dress. Ethan stopped 20 feet away. His hand rested loosely on the handle of the lantern hanging at his side, but he didn't lift it yet. He had spent enough years in the frontier to recognize danger when it found him. Trouble rarely arrived alone. The older of the two lifted her head first. Her eyes met his across the distance, steady despite the exhaustion written across her face. She didn't speak right away, just studied him as if deciding something important. The younger one leaned against her shoulder, breathing slow but uneven, as if every breath cost effort. The wind carried the smell of dust, leather, and the faint smoke from Ethan's cabin stove behind him. The kind of ordinary evening that usually meant nothing at all. Except tonight. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're a long way from Apache land," he said at last, his voice calm but firm, the way a man talks when he wants the truth before anything else. The older girl answered in careful English. "We know." Her voice was quiet, but not afraid. That caught his attention more than anything else. People who were afraid talked fast. People who were dangerous stayed quiet. She pushed herself to her feet with visible effort, steadying the younger girl beside her. "We only need one night," she said. Ethan glanced toward the open plains behind them. Nothing moved out there except grass and shadow, but the frontier had taught him that empty land could hide a lot of riders. "And why," he asked, "would 2 Apache sisters be bleeding against my fence in the middle of nowhere?" The girl hesitated, just long enough to tell him the truth wasn't simple. "Because men are following us." Ethan nodded once, slowly. That explained the blood. It didn't explain the rest. He looked again at the younger sister, who could barely stay upright now. The lantern in his hand finally lifted, its warm glow spilling across their faces. Young. Too young for the kind of trouble that traveled the frontier at night. The rancher studied the darkening horizon again, the way a man studies the weather when he knows a storm might already be on the way. He had one rule out here. Never invite strangers into your home. Not after everything the world had already taken from him. But rules had a way of bending when a person stood alone in the dark with nowhere else to go. Ethan lowered the lantern slightly and gestured toward the distant cabin. "You get one night," he said. The older sister's shoulders relaxed, just a little. "Thank you." Ethan didn't answer. He was already walking back toward the house, boots slow against the gravel, the 2 figures following behind him in silence. The stars were beginning to appear above the desert now, sharp and cold in the wide western sky. For 8 quiet years nothing had crossed the fence of Ethan Callahan's ranch except cattle and wind. Tonight, 2 Apache sisters had stepped through it. And somewhere out in the dark plains beyond the hills, riders were already looking for them. The cabin door closed behind them with a slow wooden thud that sounded louder than it should. Having a quiet night. Ethan Callahan hung the lantern on a nail beside the doorway, and the warm light spread across the single room, revealing the rough pine table, the iron stove glowing faintly with coals, and the narrow windows that looked out over miles of empty prairie. The older Apache sister guided the younger one carefully toward the chair beside the stove. Up close the younger girl looked pale beneath the dust of the trail, her breathing steady but tired as though she had walked far longer than she should have. Ethan pulled a small kettle from the stove and poured warm water into a tin cup before placing it on the table. The girl nodded in quiet thanks, but said nothing. The older sister remained standing for a moment, studying the room with careful eyes that noticed more than most travelers ever did. She noticed the rifle above the door, the extra saddle hanging by the wall, the boots placed neatly beside the hearth. The kind of details that told a story about the man who lived here. Ethan leaned against the table and folded his arms. "You said men were following you," he said calmly. "How many?" The older sister hesitated before answering. 3, maybe 4. They were riding hard. Ethan nodded once. Riders who pushed their horses after sunset meant urgency. Out here, urgency rarely meant good intentions. He glanced toward the younger sister again. "What is her name?" The older sister answered immediately. "Nala." The younger girl managed a small nod, holding the tin cup with both hands as the warmth reached her fingers. Ethan studied them both in the lantern light. Their clothes were worn from travel but well made, decorated with beadwork that carried patterns he recognized even after years away from Apache territory. These were not wanderers from some distant band. Whoever they belonged to came from a tribe that held strong traditions. "And you?" Ethan asked. The older sister met his gaze without hesitation. "Ayana." The name settled quietly into the room like a stone placed in water. Ethan walked to the window and looked out into the dark prairie. The stars had taken over the sky now, bright and cold above the wide desert plain. Somewhere far away a coyote called once before the wind carried the sound away. He had lived alone long enough to know the rhythm of this land. Tonight the rhythm felt different. Ayana spoke again, her voice steady but careful. "You should know something." Ethan turned back toward her. "Those men will not stop looking. Men who chase travelers across 30 miles of desert usually do not." Ethan replied quietly. Ayana studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring the weight of her next words. "If they reach this ranch, they will ask questions." Ethan gave a small shrug. "People ask questions all the time. And if they ask about us," she pressed. Ethan walked slowly to the door and slid the heavy wooden bar across it. The sound echoed softly through the cabin. He returned to the table and sat down across from them. The lantern flame flickered between them, casting long shadows across the walls. "Then I will tell them the truth," he said calmly. Nala looked up from her cup, concern crossing her face for the first time. "What truth?" Ethan met her eyes and allowed the faintest trace of a smile to appear beneath his beard. "That the prairie is a big place," he said, "and sometimes people get lost in it." The wind pressed lightly against the cabin walls, and the stove gave a soft metallic pop as the heat shifted inside. For a moment the room felt peaceful again, like the quiet evenings Ethan had grown used to over the years. But outside the darkness stretched across miles of open land where any rider could appear without warning. Ayana seemed to understand that better than most. She glanced toward the door, listening to the distant wind across the grasslands. "If they come," she said quietly, "they will not come quietly." Ethan followed her gaze toward the black prairie beyond the window. His voice remained steady. "Out here," he said, "nothing ever does." The night settled deeper around the ranch as the wind moved slowly across the prairie grass, whispering against the wooden walls of the cabin like an old story that refused to end. Inside, the lantern flame burned steady, throwing soft gold light across the rough boards of the floor. Ethan Callahan stood near the stove for a long moment without speaking, listening to the quiet the way a man does when silence itself might be telling him something important. Nala had finished the water and now rested in the chair beside the stove, her eyes half closed as the warmth finally began to reach her bones after miles of cold night air. Ayana remained awake, alert in a way Ethan recognized immediately. She was the kind of person who had learned not to sleep deeply when the world outside might change without warning. Ethan reached for a small wooden box on the shelf above the stove and opened it carefully. Inside were clean cloth strips, a needle, and a small bottle of clear alcohol that he had learned to keep on hand after years of tending cattle injuries alone. He set the box on the table and nodded toward Nala. "Let me see your arm," he said quietly. Nala hesitated but lifted her sleeve slowly. The mark beneath the cloth was not deep, but it had clearly come from a long ride and rough ground. Nothing that time and rest would not heal, but enough to tell Ethan she had been pushed far beyond what most travelers could endure. Ethan cleaned the wound with steady hands, the way a rancher learns to work when animals depend on him to remain calm no matter the situation. Nala watched him with quiet curiosity. "You have done this before," she said softly. Ethan gave a small shrug. "A ranch teaches a man many things," he replied. "Most of them come the hard way." Ayana leaned slightly against the wall near the window, watching the darkness outside between every few sentences. The prairie beyond the glass looked endless under the moonlight, rolling fields of pale grass that stretched toward the distant hills like waves frozen in silver. "You live here alone?" she asked after a moment. Ethan tied the last strip of cloth carefully and nodded once. 8 years. Nala's eyes opened a little wider. "That is a long time to hear only the wind." Ethan placed the bottle back in the wooden box and closed it with a soft click. "The wind does not lie," he said simply. Ayana studied him for a moment as if that answer meant more than he intended to explain. People who had traveled the frontier understood that some men chose solitude because the world behind them had become too heavy to carry forward. The stove crackled softly, and the smell of burning cedar drifted through the cabin. Outside, the horses in the small corral shifted quietly, their hooves brushing against dry earth. As they settled for the night, Ethan poured another cup of warm water and slid it toward Ayana. She accepted it with a small nod. "You could have turned us away," she said quietly. Ethan looked at the lantern for a moment before answering. "Out here," he said slowly, "the desert does not forgive people who have nowhere to go." A long silence followed, the kind that only happens when strangers begin to understand one another without needing many words. Nala finally leaned back in the chair and allowed her eyes to close completely. Exhaustion had claimed her at last. Ayana remained awake, though her shoulders had relaxed slightly now that the younger girl was resting. Ethan moved toward the window again and looked across the prairie once more. The land appeared empty under the moonlight, but years of watching this country had taught him that emptiness could change quickly. Riders could appear over those distant ridges without warning. Dust by day, shadows by night. Somewhere far out across the plains a faint sound drifted through the wind. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. It was distant enough that most people would not have noticed it at all. But a rancher who lived alone learned to recognize every sound the prairie could make. Hooves carried through open land in a very particular rhythm. Ethan remained still for several seconds, listening carefully as the wind shifted direction across the fields. Ayana saw the change in his expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Ethan did not turn from the window. The sound had faded again into the wind, leaving only the whisper of grass beneath the moonlight. After another moment, he spoke calmly. "Probably nothing," he said. But the rancher did not step away from the window. And outside, somewhere far beyond the quiet hills, the prairie wind continued to carry a rhythm that sounded very much like horses traveling through the night. The sound did not come again for several minutes, and yet Ethan Callahan did not move away from the window. The prairie stretched out before him like a vast silver ocean beneath the moon, every blade of grass bending slowly in the night wind. To someone who did not know the land, it looked empty. But Ethan had spent 8 long years learning every sound that lived in that emptiness. Coyotes cried in uneven bursts. Cattle shifted with slow, heavy steps. The wind itself carried a low, restless murmur across the hills. Horses were different. Horses carried rhythm. And for a moment earlier, the rancher had heard that rhythm moving through the dark. Behind him the cabin remained quiet. Nala slept deeply now, her breathing steady beside the warmth of the stove. Ayana remained standing near the wall, watching Ethan carefully as though she could read the thoughts forming behind his calm expression. "You heard something," she said quietly after a while. Ethan did not answer immediately. He rested one hand against the wooden window frame and continued studying the distant prairie as if the land itself might reveal what was coming. "Maybe," he said at last. Ayana stepped closer to the window but kept her voice low so she would not wake her sister. "The men who followed us ride fast," she said. "But they are careful." Ethan glanced at her briefly. Careful men do not ride across open prairie at night unless they are certain of where they are going. Ayana understood the meaning of that immediately. If the riders were still out there, they were not wandering blindly. They were tracking something. The lantern flame flickered as the wind pressed lightly against the cabin walls. The shadows moved across the wooden floor like slow, drifting clouds. Ethan stepped away from the window and walked to the door, lifting the bar slightly before easing it back into place again. The habit came from years of living alone. Out here a man checked his door the way a sailor checked the ropes on his boat before a storm. Those men, Ethan said quietly as he returned to the table. What do they want from you? Ayanna remained silent for several seconds. The question had been waiting in the room since the moment they stepped through the door. Now it could not be avoided any longer. She lowered her voice even further. They believe we carry something important. Ethan folded his arms slowly. Do you? Ayanna met his gaze without blinking. No. The answer came too quickly to carry doubt. Yet Ethan noticed something else in her expression. Not fear. Not dishonesty. Something closer to caution. As though the truth itself had edges sharp enough to cut anyone who touched it carelessly. Nala shifted slightly in her sleep, and the chair creaked softly beneath her weight. Ethan glanced toward her before speaking again. Men who chase two women across miles of desert usually believe their reason is worth the trouble, he said. Ayanna nodded once. They believe many things. Ethan waited, but she did not continue. The silence stretched again, filled only by the quiet crackle of the stove and the faint wind beyond the walls. Finally Ayanna spoke again. They think we are alone, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Are you not? For the first time since entering the cabin, a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a person gives when they know something others do not. No, she said softly. Ethan studied her for a long moment. The frontier had taught him that words carried weight when spoken carefully. Ayanna had chosen that one deliberately. Before he could ask more, the sound returned. This time it was clearer. Very faint. Very far away. But unmistakable. Hooves striking hard earth in a steady traveling rhythm. Ethan turned his head slowly toward the window. The prairie wind carried the sound again, rolling softly across the land before fading once more into the vast silence of the desert. Ayanna heard it too now. Her eyes lifted toward the dark horizon beyond the cabin walls. They found the trail, she whispered. Ethan remained calm, but his gaze had sharpened like a man measuring distance across open ground. Somewhere beyond the hills riders were crossing the prairie under the cold moonlight, moving steadily toward the lonely ranch that had not seen visitors in 8 years. And the night was far from over. For several long minutes no one in the cabin spoke. The wind outside continued to move slowly across the prairie, brushing the tall grass in waves that shimmered under the pale moonlight. Ethan Callahan stood near the window again, listening the way a man listens when his instincts begin to speak louder than the quiet around him. The sound had been faint, but it had been real. Riders. Far away, but moving in this direction. Out here sound traveled strange distances. A horse running across dry ground could be heard for miles if the wind carried it right. Ethan had learned that lesson years ago while tracking stray cattle across open country. Ayanna remained beside the table, her eyes fixed on the same dark horizon beyond the glass. She did not ask Ethan if the riders were close. She already knew the answer would not make the night any easier. Nala stirred in her sleep, but did not wake. The warmth of the stove and the long miles behind her had finally claimed the last of her strength. Ethan moved slowly across the room and lifted the lantern from its nail, adjusting the wick so the light dimmed slightly. The cabin sank deeper into shadow, leaving only a quiet glow across the table and stove. Ayanna watched him carefully. Why lower the light? She asked softly. Ethan set the lantern down again and spoke without raising his voice. A bright window in the middle of dark prairie can be seen from a long way off. Ayanna nodded once. She understood that kind of caution. The frontier had a way of teaching the same lessons to very different people. Ethan stepped onto the porch for a moment and looked across the land. The night air was cold and dry against his face, carrying the scent of sage and dust that always followed the wind through this part of the territory. The moon hung low above the distant hills, silver light stretching across miles of quiet ground. At first the prairie looked empty. Then Ethan saw it. Far out along the dark line of the southern ridge, a faint movement shifted across the horizon. Not a shape exactly. More like a slow ripple where the land met the sky. A rancher who spent his life watching cattle across open fields knew how to read that ripple. Dust. Very faint, but drifting upward in the still moonlight. Ethan stood there for a long moment studying it before stepping quietly back inside the cabin. Ayanna read the answer in his face before he spoke. How many? She asked. Ethan placed the lantern back on the table and folded his arms again. Hard to say from this distance, he replied calmly. But more than one. Nala opened her eyes slowly now, sensing the change in the air around them even before she heard the words. They are close? She asked. Ethan shook his head once. Not yet. The younger girl sat up carefully, glancing toward the door as if she could see through the thick wooden boards into the night beyond. Ayanna placed a hand on her shoulder in reassurance. Rest, she said quietly. But Nala did not lie back down. She watched Ethan instead. If they come here, she said, they will ask you about us. Ethan gave a small nod. They probably will. Ayanna studied him carefully. And what will you say? The rancher walked slowly to the stove and placed another small piece of cedar onto the coals. The fire answered with a soft crackle that filled the room with the smell of warm wood smoke. Only after the sound faded did Ethan speak again. I will say what I already told you, he said calmly. The prairie is a big place. Ayanna's eyes remained on him. And if they do not believe you? Ethan looked at the closed cabin door for a moment. Outside, the wind brushed across the ranch yard and the horses in the corral shifted quietly, unaware of the riders still miles away crossing the open land. Then the rancher spoke again, his voice steady and unhurried. Out here, he said, a man does not always get to choose who rides onto his land. He paused for a moment before adding one more quiet sentence. But he does get to choose who leaves it. Outside, the faint dust on the southern ridge continued drifting slowly upward under the cold moonlight as the riders moved steadily across the prairie toward the lonely ranch that now held two unexpected guests. The prairie wind changed sometime after midnight. It came colder now, sliding down from the distant hills and carrying the dry scent of stone and sage across Ethan Callahan's land. Inside the cabin, the lantern burned low, its soft glow barely reaching the corners of the room. No one slept anymore. Nala sat upright in the chair near the stove, her earlier exhaustion replaced by the quiet alertness that comes when a traveler knows the night is not finished with them yet. Ayanna remained near the window beside Ethan, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could see the riders even from this distance. Ethan stood still with his arms resting lightly against the wooden frame of the window. The dust on the southern ridge had grown clearer under the moonlight. Not large. Not yet. But it was rising slowly, drifting upward in a thin gray ribbon that moved exactly the way riders moved across dry ground. The rancher had seen that sign many times before when cattle drives passed along the distant trails. Tonight the dust carried a different meaning. Ayanna spoke quietly beside him. They are still coming. Ethan nodded once. Yes. Nala looked toward the door. How long? Ethan watched the ridge a moment longer before answering. Maybe an hour, he said calmly. Maybe less if they push their horses. The cabin fell silent again. Outside, the wind brushed softly across the barn roof, and the wooden fence rails creaked in slow, tired rhythms. The land itself seemed to be waiting. Ayanna finally turned away from the window and faced Ethan fully. The lantern light caught the dark beads along the edge of her dress as she spoke. We did not want to bring this to your door. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Trouble usually finds its own way, he replied. Nala studied him carefully. You could still tell them we forced you, she said. You could say we came without permission. Ethan almost smiled at that. You did come without permission, he said. Nala blinked slightly, unsure whether he was joking. The rancher's expression remained calm. But you also knocked, he added. That counts for something. Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly, as though that answer carried more weight than she expected. For a moment, she seemed to consider saying something more. Instead, she asked a different question. Why do you live this far from anyone? Ethan moved away from the window and rested one hand on the back of the chair across from them. The question hung quietly in the warm air of the cabin. After a few seconds, he answered simply. Because no one else wanted this land. Nala looked around the small room again, at the stove, the saddle gear hanging on the wall, the narrow bed against the far side of the cabin. It does not seem like land no one would want. Ethan followed her gaze. Most people prefer neighbors, he said. Ayanna watched him carefully. And you do not. Ethan gave a small shrug. Neighbors ask questions. The wind shifted again outside and carried a faint new sound through the prairie grass. This time all three of them heard it clearly. Hooves. still distant but no longer uncertain. Nala straightened in her chair. Ayana stepped closer to the door instinctively. Ethan did not move at all. He listened carefully for several seconds, counting the rhythm of the sound the way a rancher counts cattle in a moving herd. Then he spoke quietly. 3 riders. Ayana nodded slowly. The same ones. Nala's voice dropped to a whisper. They will reach the ranch soon. Ethan walked to the lantern and turned the wick slightly lower until the cabin dimmed even further. Shadows deepened along the wooden walls, leaving only a small circle of light around the stove. Then we should not waste the quiet we have left, he said. Outside, the distant hoofbeats continued rolling across the open prairie, growing clearer with every passing minute as the riders followed the trail that led directly to the lonely ranch standing alone beneath the wide American sky. The hoofbeats grew clearer as the night moved slowly toward morning. They rolled across the prairie in steady rhythm, no longer distant enough to ignore. Ethan Callahan stood beside the window and listened carefully, counting the spacing between each sound the way a rancher counts thunder before a storm. 3 horses, just as he had said, riding hard but controlled. The kind of riders who knew exactly where they were going. The wind carried the sound straight across the open grassland and into the quiet yard outside the cabin. Inside, the lantern burned low, leaving the room wrapped in shadow and warm firelight. Nala had risen from the chair now, standing beside her sister near the table. The earlier exhaustion was gone from her eyes. Whatever strength she had left had returned the moment the riders came closer. Ayana's gaze never left the door. They will reach the ranch soon, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Yes. The hoofbeats continued to approach, growing louder with every passing moment until even the horses in Ethan's small corral began to stir uneasily. Outside, leather saddles creaked faintly in the night air. A horse snorted softly as the riders slowed near the fence line. The sound of hooves against dry earth came to a stop somewhere just beyond the cabin yard. For a moment nothing happened. The prairie returned to silence so suddenly that it felt almost unnatural. Then came the faint sound of boots touching the ground. A single voice drifted through the darkness outside the cabin. Calm, confident. Rancher, the man called. We know you are awake. Ethan did not move immediately. He stood still for 2 seconds longer, listening to the night as if the land itself might answer the stranger before he did. Then he walked slowly to the door and lifted the wooden bar. Ayana stepped slightly forward. You do not have to open it, she said quietly. Ethan glanced back at her. They already know we are here. Nala spoke softly beside her. They will search the ranch. Ethan rested his hand against the door handle. Not tonight, he said calmly. He pulled the door open. Cold night air flowed into the cabin immediately, carrying the smell of dust and horses with it. 3 riders stood in the moonlit yard just beyond the porch. Their horses waited behind them near the fence, steam rising slowly from their nostrils in the cool air. The man in front stepped forward first. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a long coat that moved slightly in the wind. His posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent many years traveling the frontier. Evening, the man said. Ethan stepped onto the porch but did not move any farther. It is past midnight, he replied evenly. The man allowed a small smile. Then I suppose it is morning somewhere. His eyes moved briefly past Ethan's shoulder toward the dim interior of the cabin before returning again. We are looking for 2 travelers, he continued. Apache girls. Young. One of them injured. Ethan leaned lightly against the porch railing as if the conversation meant nothing more than a casual visit between strangers on a lonely road. This ranch sits 30 miles from the nearest town, he said. Travelers do not usually come this far by accident. The rider studied him carefully. Sometimes accidents happen. Ethan nodded slowly. They do. The man's gaze sharpened slightly. Have you seen them? Ethan allowed a moment of quiet to pass before answering. The wind brushed across the prairie behind the riders, carrying the faint rustle of grass beneath the moonlight. Finally the rancher spoke. No, he said calmly. The 3 riders exchanged a brief glance between themselves. The leader looked back at Ethan again, measuring the man standing calmly on the porch of a ranch that had not seen visitors in years. That is interesting, the rider said slowly. Because their trail led straight here. Ethan shrugged once. The prairie has many trails. The man's smile faded slightly. Yes, he said. But some trails do not disappear so easily. For a moment, the two men simply looked at one another across the quiet yard, the cold moonlight stretching across the wooden porch between them, while somewhere behind Ethan inside the dim cabin two Apache sisters listened without making a sound. The man on the ground studied Ethan Callahan for a long quiet moment, as if the answer he wanted might appear somewhere behind the rancher's calm expression. The prairie wind drifted slowly through the yard, carrying the faint smell of dust and horse leather beneath the cold moonlight. Behind the rider, the two other men remained still beside their horses, watching the porch with the patience of men who had spent many nights waiting in places just like this. Finally, the rider spoke again. "Mind if we take a look around?" Ethan rested one arm on the wooden railing of the porch as though the request meant nothing at all. "You can look at the prairie all you want," he said evenly. "There is a lot of it." The rider's eyes narrowed slightly. "I meant the ranch." Ethan shrugged once. "There is not much to see here either." The wind shifted across the open land, and for a brief second the lantern glow from inside the cabin spilled faintly across the porch boards. The rider noticed it immediately. His gaze flicked past Ethan's shoulder toward the doorway. "You live alone out here?" he asked. Ethan did not turn around. "Most days." The rider tilted his head slightly, as though the answer amused him. "Most days," he repeated. His boots crunched softly against the dry dirt as he took 2 slow steps closer to the porch. "You seem like a reasonable man," he continued. "We are not looking for trouble. Just 2 travelers who ran off with something that does not belong to them." Ethan's voice remained steady. "That sounds like a problem for someone else." The rider smiled faintly. "Maybe, but their trail led straight here." Ethan nodded toward the wide prairie behind them. "A lot of trails do." The man stopped at the bottom step of the porch. For several seconds he said nothing at all. The silence stretched across the yard, broken only by the quiet shifting of horses near the fence. Then he spoke again, his voice calmer now. "Let us make this simple, rancher." He gestured toward the dark land behind him. 2 Apache girls rode across this prairie tonight. One of them injured. Their horses slowed not far from here. After that, their tracks disappear. Ethan gave a small nod. "Strange how the desert does that." The rider looked up at him. "Deserts do not erase tracks this quickly." Ethan leaned slightly against the porch post. "Wind does." The rider's smile faded again. "You are protecting them." Ethan did not answer immediately. Inside the cabin, just beyond the doorway, the faint creak of wood shifted as someone moved carefully across the floor. The rider heard it too. His eyes lifted toward the dark interior behind Ethan. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. Ethan did not turn around. "Old wood," he said. "Cabins like this make noise all night." The rider studied him again, weighing the calm in Ethan's voice against the growing suspicion in his own mind. Then something changed in the air. At first it was almost impossible to notice. A faint tremor beneath the ground, subtle enough that only a man used to living on open land might feel it. Ethan's eyes shifted slightly toward the horizon beyond the riders. The man at the bottom step noticed the movement. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Ethan did not answer right away. The wind rolled slowly across the prairie grass, carrying a new sound with it. Very faint at first, then growing stronger. Hooves. Many of them. The rider turned his head toward the dark plains behind him. His 2 companions did the same. The sound grew clearer with every passing second, spreading across the land like distant thunder rolling over the hills. Dust began to rise along the far ridge, pale and wide beneath the moonlight. The rider stared at it for a moment before speaking under his breath. "That is a lot of horses." Ethan finally looked back down at him. His voice remained quiet. "Yes." The rider turned slowly toward the approaching horizon again, the confidence in his posture fading slightly as the thunder of hooves continued growing across the vast open prairie. The sound of hooves spread across the prairie like distant thunder rolling through the open night. At first it was only a low trembling beneath the wind, but within seconds it grew stronger, deeper, filling the wide valley beyond Ethan Callahan's ranch with a rhythm that no rider could mistake. The man standing at the bottom of the porch steps slowly turned his head toward the southern ridge where the dust was rising. His 2 companions did the same. In the pale moonlight the horizon was beginning to move. A long shadow stretched across the prairie grass as horse after horse appeared over the ridge line, their shapes cutting through the silver glow of the night sky. They rode in silence, but there were many of them. more than the 3 riders standing in Ethan's yard had expected to see. The leader of the strangers narrowed his eyes, counting the silhouettes as they spread slowly across the hilltop. "That is a lot of riders," he said quietly. Ethan Callahan rested both hands on the porch railing and watched the distant approach without any change in his calm expression. "Yes," he said again. The thunder of hooves continued to roll closer across the open land. Dust lifted higher behind the approaching line of horses, forming a pale cloud that drifted through the moonlight like mist above the prairie. Soon the figures became clearer. Dozens of riders now, moving in a wide arc that carried them steadily toward the ranch. Their horses moved with the smooth confidence of animals that had crossed long distances under experienced hands. The man at the bottom of the steps swallowed slowly. "You expecting company tonight, rancher?" Ethan did not look at him. "No," he said, "but sometimes the prairie sends visitors whether you ask for them or not." The riders reached the far fence line a minute later and slowed their horses together as though guided by an unspoken signal. The ground trembled gently beneath the weight of so many animals as they spread out across the yard beyond the cabin. The 3 strangers who had arrived earlier stepped back instinctively now, their confidence fading beneath the quiet presence of the approaching group. At the center of the riders, a single horse moved forward through the dust. The man riding it sat tall and still, his posture carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded men for many years. When he reached the open space before the porch, he drew his horse to a stop and looked up at Ethan. For several seconds no one spoke. The wind moved slowly across the prairie again, stirring the grass beneath the hooves of dozens of horses waiting in silence. Finally the man on horseback nodded once. "You are Ethan Callahan," he said. Ethan studied him calmly. "That is my name." The rider's gaze moved briefly toward the open cabin door behind Ethan before returning again. "You gave shelter tonight," he continued. Ethan did not answer immediately. Then he said simply, "Yes." The rider inclined his head slightly, as though that answer confirmed something he already knew. Behind Ethan inside the cabin, Ayanna and Nala stepped quietly into the doorway. The moment the man on horseback saw them, his expression softened. Ayanna lowered her head respectfully. "Father," she said. The 3 strangers standing in the yard looked from the riders to the 2 sisters and back again, understanding slowly spreading across their faces. The man who had questioned Ethan earlier cleared his throat nervously. "We did not realize," he began. The rider on horseback raised one hand gently, and the man stopped speaking at once. The leader of the Apache riders looked again toward Ethan on the porch. "You protected my daughters," he said. Ethan gave a small nod. "They asked for one night." The man studied him for another moment before speaking again. "Then you will have the protection of my people for as long as this land stands." Behind him, dozens of riders sat quietly on their horses beneath the wide American sky. The prairie wind moved through the grass once more, and the long line of Apache warriors lowered their heads together in silent respect. Ethan Callahan did not say anything more. He simply stood on the porch of his lonely ranch and watched the sunrise beginning to touch the edge of the distant hills while the first light of morning spread across the land he had chosen to call home.